John and Behnam, thanks so much for sitting down with me. Honestly, I can't think of two leading experts who I'd rather sit down with and talk for a while, given everything that's happened this week in the Middle East. One of the more significant weeks, I'd say, in memory. And for those of the listeners who've been busy with their lives and haven't had a chance to follow everything, or John, may have missed one of your excellent morning briefs, I'm wondering if we could just start, John, by kind of giving us a quick overview rundown of the major developments this week, perhaps starting with the attack in the Golan Heights, if that works.
Sure. Well, I'd say the first act of the drama that we're watching right now started on Saturday. That was when Hezbollah apparently was firing at Israel from Lebanon, had been aiming for a military target closer to the border, but overshot its mark. And the Falak 1 rocket that they fired traveled a good bit more and ended up hitting a soccer field filled with Druze children, Arab children, and ended up killing 12. It was a shocking day for Israelis. It was probably the most momentous day that the Israelis had experienced since the October 7th attack. And there was already frustration in Israel building about the thousands of rockets and drones that Hezbollah has been firing into Israel over the course of the last 9+ months. You'll recall they started firing on Israel on October 8th, the day after the Hamas attack. Israel has absorbed these attacks. They've responded, but it's really been kind of tit for tat kind of violence. This was a moment where the Israelis said, okay, we've had enough. And in the couple of days that passed after that attack, the Sunday, Monday, and into Tuesday, we were hearing that the Israelis were preparing for their attack. You'll recall Benjamin Netanyahu had been in Washington he had just given his speech before joint session of Congress, and then he went down to Florida and he met with Donald Trump. He cut his trip short by a few hours. He came home. He consulted with his top security people, with his generals from the IDF. The Israelis were allowing Americans to leave, or foreigners to leave Lebanon in preparation for what would be this strike. And then on Tuesday afternoon, around midday here, our time, that's when we heard the news that Israel had launched a strike into the Dahia neighborhood of Beirut. Dahia is the stronghold of Hamas. And they took out Fuad Shukr, who is the number 2, or was the number 2 or number 3 in the Hamas military structure. It was pinpoint intelligence. It was a lethal strike. Obviously, the Israelis had a beat on where he was. Someone had revealed his location, or somehow it was revealed to the Israelis where he was, and he was taken out. He, by the way, was not just responsible for the attack that killed the 12 children on Saturday. He was also involved in the 1983 Marine barracks bombing that killed 241 American service members. So I think there was probably a good bit of cheering going on among the Marine families.
Not just Marines, soldiers as well, I would say.
That's right. Yeah.
And the French. and the French.
Americans who were probably pretty happy about what happened there. But the drama didn't even end there. Because about 10 hours later, the news broke. It was middle of the night in Tehran. And as it turns out, there had been a delegation of terrorist groups, proxy groups, that Iran had invited to attend the inauguration of Iran's new president. Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, was among them. He attended the inauguration, and then he went back to his apartment in Tehran at the end of the day, where he was taken out by a bomb that had reportedly now been placed there several months ago by an Israeli agent, presumably. And then that bomb was detonated, killing him, and as we understand it, a bodyguard as well. But I think the Israelis were over the course of about 10 hours, 12 hours, they really signaled a change in momentum in this war. They demonstrated that they were able to strike their enemies deep in the heart of their enemy's territory. And, I think now the Middle East is bracing for a response. Iran has vowed a response. What they do obviously remains to be seen. The Israelis are bracing for whatever may come, but one does get a sense that the momentum is starting to shift in this war, at least for the time being.
Well, that's a great rundown, John. Thank you for that. Ben, I'm coming to you. So in terms of the Golan strike that killed those 12 teens and injured roughly 50 innocent people, and then the subsequent Shukr killing and the Haniyeh killing, how does this all look from the vantage point of the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, we can only get into Khamenei or the IRGC's head by way of some of their speeches or their actions. But I have to tell you, I strongly concur with that last bit of what John said, which is it looks like a potential shift in the tide of this war. I mean, make no mistake, both Iran and its terrorist apparatus have an immense ability to absorb pain, perhaps even greater than their ability to inflict pain. This is the fact that they merely need to limp along to survive, to fight another day. And every time they do that, that's how they set the bar so low for an achievable victory. And when that is the bar, and when they're enacting a death by a thousand cuts strategy against Israel and increasingly against the U.S. force presence we can talk about in the region, they believe that most of the past 10 months was going their way. They felt that they had delayed, a potential Abraham Accords 2.0, that Iran was rope-a-doping diplomatically a whole host of U.S. partners and allies in the region, that Iran was able to claim its first ever overt and kinetic and direct ballistic missile, cruise missile, and drone attack from Iranian territory against Israeli territorial, and Israel could not do the same politically. And, this line that I've been saying, that they are able to use military means to achieve political ends. But the losses this network has taken and the incompetence that the network has been shown to possess at its core, in its capital city, in its security forces, that I think has rattled the system. I don't think it's thrown them off entirely. Certainly, you're going to continue this boom and bust cycle of violence. As John said, the regime has promised revenge. Khamenei has talked about a severe punishment. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has talked about a hard revenge. This is the same kind of language that preceded the strike on U.S. positions in Iraq after the U.S. killed Soleimani in 2020, as well as the April 1 to April 13 kind of Iranian filling of the media space after what they alleged was their consulate was attacked in Syria. So I think on balance, strategically, they're going to continue to push, but they understand they have a lot of homework to do and they have a lot more vulnerabilities. And the Israelis just showcased, I have to say, with relative ease and with immense precision, those vulnerabilities, not just inside the head of the snake, but at the different arms of the axis as well.
Those are great insights as well, and I would just add to the mix to give a even more fulsome picture on what's transpired. We've also seen a resumption in attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. This is something that our Center on Military and Political Power here follows closely, and we have a live tracker that we update regularly. And I would just offer to the listeners that since July 16th, there have been 5 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. A one-way attack on a drone on July 16th launched at Al-Assad Air Base. July 25th, multiple rockets launched at that same base. Thankfully, no damage or casualties reported in that attack, but they were trying to kill people. Then July 25th, a rocket attack in Syria. July 26th, another rocket attack against the same Conoco mission support site in Syria. Thankfully, no American service members were wounded in that one. And then July 27th, another rocket attack against that same site. And so some in Washington, maybe in the Biden administration, might take a deep breath and say, oh, that's great. No Americans got injured or killed. Of course, that's great. Of course, that's great. But as I've said and others said for a long time, since October 17th, there have been 172 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. 172 attacks. We've responded. We, the United States of America, have responded roughly 11 to 12 times. And many of us warned that if we didn't respond more forcefully and more quickly, these attacks would continue. That's exactly what happened in the Tower 22 attack in Jordan, where 3 American service members lost their lives and will be returning home to their families. And we have seen a response by this administration, but I am concerned, John, that if we see the same sort of delay delayed, weak responses to these attacks in Iraq and Syria, especially if things start to heat up in Lebanon or elsewhere, that we're going to see a massive resumption in attacks in our forces. And so that's why I'm pushing to have encourage the administration, Pentagon, CENTCOM to make sure that our forward position troops standing between us and those who want to kill us have the firepower and force protection they need to defend themselves and the political permission to hit back. Anything you want to add to that, John?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously important. Force protection for us, the threat of overwhelming firepower from us, I think is important in terms of the threat posed to U.S. assets, U.S. personnel around the region. And that obviously needs to be kind of top of mind, right, for us. I do think, though, that there's another piece of this. If the goal is eventually to try to bring any of this to a soft landing, because I do think we need to be honest here. We're on the precipice of a regional war. We don't know how Iran is going to respond. We don't know how Hezbollah is going to respond. We do know that there are 7 fronts that right now are active in the Middle East, right? We've got Gaza, we've got Lebanon, we've got the West Bank, you've got Iraq, you've got Syria, Yemen, and you've got Iran itself. All of these have gone hot at different points over the last 9-10 months. And it's quite possible that in response to Israel's strikes, their daring strikes, it's actually quite possible that the supreme leader activates all of the 6 proxies to fire on Israel. And the regime itself has already vowed a direct response. So we really could be looking at something that we've not seen before. And I happen to believe, and it's interesting, I've had a lot of conversations over the last couple of days with foreign policy specialists from really across the political spectrum here. And I think we've kind of arrived at a central thesis of how things have gotten this bad over the last several months. And I actually think it all tracks back to all of the attempts by the United States to restrain the Israelis. In other words, we're watching right now an aggressive Iran activating its violent proxies, and every time they carry out an attack, and then Israel responds with force, the response is not to give the Israelis what they need in order to win. The response has been to restrain the Israelis. And when that happens, and by the way, we've heard it. I know, Behnam, I'm curious to see what you're seeing in Farsi. I know what I've seen in Arabic from Hezbollah. They think this is a great opportunity to fight Israel. In other words, in Israel with one hand tied behind its back, that's actually being tied behind its back by the United States, looks like a terrific opportunity for them to up the ante, to put more pressure on the Israelis, because they know that the U.S. is not willing to allow this thing to escalate. What actually I think needs to happen is not only do we have to deploy superior firepower to the region and make sure that we're deterring violence against American servicemen, but I think we ought to be conveying to Iran, to Hezbollah, to the entire Iranian axis, that if they choose to escalate, that we are not going to restrain the Israelis, that we're going to give them the weapons that they need in order to finish the job, and to do so emphatically. That would be the moment, I suspect, that the supreme leader of Iran says, okay, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is this the time that I want to take risks where I could potentially see my grip on power begin to unravel because of mistakes that I'm making on the battlefield? This is the kind of, I think, deterrence that we should be looking for. I think we've missed opportunities until now, but it's still rectifiable, in my view, with enough deterrence, with enough snarling at the Iranians. We still could see them stand down. I am, of course, curious to hear whether Behnam agrees, but I think their primary goal, and always has been, is survival, right? None of this is worth it if they don't survive. And so threatening their survival, their stability, seems to me like the way to go here.
John, I think that's a great point. Just a quick interjection, then Behnam, I want to go directly to you to answer John's good question, to see whether you agree or what you would add to it. I would just say, one doesn't need to study strategy for years or be a former military officer to understand the truth of what John just said there, is that if Israel's adversaries believe that they can hit Israel, and then predictably, like you can set your watch to it, this administration will roll in and restrain Israel, then of course you're going to invite more attacks because they can rely on a more restrained response because of American pressure on Jerusalem. So perhaps good intention by this administration, but naive and dangerous, I would say. And we've seen that play out time and time again. The colloquialism is, take the win, Israel. Well, take the win, Israel is going to be interpreted by Israel's enemies as America not willing to do difficult things to stand by its best friend in the region and it's on its worst day. And it's going to simply invite more of the same that this administration doesn't want. Do you agree, disagree? Anything you want to add there, Behnam?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I want to make sure I address everyone's components as completely as possible. Maybe starting from the end, even if the win is taken, I think the historic point made by April 13, April 14, is that from here on out, even though Israel and Iran went back to their shadow war, that there is now forever a non-zero chance of an overt shooting war in anything between the Iranians and the Israelis. And as much as the Israelis are the masters of the overt conventional military space, the fact that the Iranians can begin to scale this up means that the Iranians are using the own best weapons of the Israelis against them. So that too is creating a little bit of a political bind. From that will flow that even if the Americans are able to surge this architecture, this integrated air and missile defense architecture, perhaps they'll be able to pick off European partners. Perhaps they'll be able to have Arab partners not join as robustly. That's the point of this boom and bust cycle of violence that you've seen them really push for. And that's really their theory of the case, is staying in the fight, playing to win, extending the timeline, because all that stuff buys time, to what John said, for the survival of the regime. And then from that flows, if you are going to threaten the survival of the regime, well, you better be prepared for the counterpunch. And this is where I think our side does need to do a little bit more homework and have a bit more intellectual honesty. Because there's a lot of calls for a resurrection of the Reagan strategy right now. But what the Iranian officials are saying is that the America of today is not the same America of 10, 20, 30 years ago. This is almost a direct quote from the head of the IRGC a month after we left Afghanistan in the way that we did.
In terms of capability, political will, or both? In terms of
political will. Okay. And that the lack of resolve has led to a diminishment of the credibility of the American military threat. And the wins that we've achieved with our limited force posture, the by, with, and through element of working with our allies, the not Papa Bear, the not Mama Bear, the medium bear kind of baby bear sized approach of our new force posture in places like Iraq and Syria with the CT mission, make them great targets for exactly what the Shia militias are doing in the region, and potentially, God forbid, even for the Iranians. There's a reason the Iranians are not attacking Al Udeid. There's a reason the Houthis only once or twice fired at Dafra. There's a reason no one is firing at Prince Khalid or Prince Sultan Air Base. Those would be too big to fail as a sort of a mission. This stuff, outposts in the desert, this is basically what the Iranians are trying to do, which is to death by 1,000 cuts against our force presence. And so if we're going to threaten that which they hold dear, threaten their survival, we have to be ready for the counterpunch. There's a reason that there was a surge in maritime harassment in 2019 once we went after their oil supplies. There was a reason that Iran started to threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz once the European enacted oil sanctions in 2011, 2012. There's a reason that actually 2020 January was the second most dangerous month for our force presence in Iraq. After Soleimani, things got worse, not better. So I'm not concerned about the argument that John is making, which is that we have to be prepared to punch back and snarl at them. I want us to make sure that we have the offset to their offset ready, the plan C ready to their plan B once we decide to kind of connect the dots and say, hey, it's not a capabilities question, it's a resolve question. Because what the Iranians are getting away with in the region is that understanding that we will be forced to pocket everything. Take the win, Israel. America, this is not worth responding to. These are all problems we have to manage, not to solve. And all of that redounds to the deterrent dividends of the Iranians, such that the only two things that will allow the Iranians to get a free one in, if they so choose to fire again, is exactly what John said, which is that American restraint is being applied to American partners in the region rather than American adversaries in the region. And that second, coupled with what Iran is doing on the nuclear program, more robust threats to expand this program and move towards weaponization can basically deter or hold back the Americans. So I think this combination, American restraint plus increasing nuclear escalation, equals deterrence for the Iranians.
John, since, as you know better than anyone, since October 8th, on an almost daily basis, Israel has been receiving attacks from Hezbollah. More than 3,000 attacks by our count. It's been steadily escalating. I would say more frequent, more intense, deeper strikes. But there's been what appears to be on both sides of the blue line, a desire to at least in the past, to avoid going to a full-scale war. John, what has been the Israeli perspective, would you say, on wanting, at least into the past, up to this point, to avoid that full-scale war with Hezbollah?
It's interesting, Brad, and obviously you and I have talked about this in the past. Israel has kicked the can down the road on this war for quite some time. They knew what Hezbollah was doing, developing, precision-guided munitions, developing new capabilities, whether by drone, rocket, missile, underground or underwater drones. We know they have those capabilities. There's even rumors of some kind of unconventional weapons that Hezbollah has been developing. The threat has grown, and every day that Israel has failed to address it, Hezbollah has grown stronger. That has been the strategy. Is actually, it's been a non-strategy. It's let's postpone this so we don't have to deal with the problem. The Israelis did have what they called their campaign between the wars, where they were trying to knock out elements of the precision program. They were interdicting weapons that were transferred by way of the airport in Damascus or via truck from Iran through Syria. There were any number of things that were happening, and the Israelis were maybe mitigating the problem. But I would argue that since October 8th, when Hezbollah started firing, there has been a complete paradigm shift within Israel. The fear is that, we're all aware of the Nukba forces that carried out the attacks on 10/7. Those were Hezbollah special forces, and they are not as well trained, not as professional, not as lethal as the Radwan forces. These are Hezbollah special forces that have been trained over the years to conquer territory in northern Israel. And the Israelis at this point, I think, coupled with the attacks that they've absorbed, in addition to the fact that you've got about 100,000 Israelis that have been evacuated from their homes in northern Israel, and then add to that all the concerns about the varying capabilities that we've seen, the attack that took place on Saturday that killed 12 children, the Israelis are ready for this. Look, they don't want the war. They never asked for the war. I think we've heard it. They'd probably prefer to wait a year before waging this war because of munitions, because their troops are tired, because they like their economy to rebound. There are myriad reasons why the Israelis might want to wait. But they also understand that, sometimes you can't plan for when a war takes place. Sometimes you need to stand your ground. And I think that is the shift in mentality that we're seeing here. There's a toughness. There's sort of a tenacity that we're hearing from the Israeli side. And as much as they don't want it, my personal opinion is that after the liquidation of Ismail Haniyeh and Mohammed Deif, and earlier this year, Marwan Issa, the deputy commander of the military, before that, Salah Haruri was killed in Lebanon. The leadership of Hamas has been eviscerated. Hamas is barely a fighting force at this point. They've got maybe 5,000 fighters. The Israelis can mop them up, I think, fairly quickly. They control the supply lines to Gaza, those tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor. This part of it may be over, and it just may be just in time for the Israelis to pivot north. And by the way, I think, it's worth noting that perhaps an overwhelming show of force along that Lebanese border, in other words, with the guns facing Hezbollah, with the realization within Hezbollah's leadership ranks that the big one is coming, you could still see them stand down. But Israel needs to be ready for any contingency here, because this will be a knockdown, drag-out war with Hezbollah if it indeed erupts.
That makes sense to me. In a piece a few weeks back, we talked about Israel's desire to, if possible, and as you said, John, unfortunately the enemy gets a vote, if possible, to avoid simultaneous large-scale military operations in Gaza and Lebanon, to concerns among serious Israeli national security experts about Hezbollah's formidable arsenal, which, as we three know, and many of the listeners will know, includes at least 150,000, probably closer to 200,000 mortars, short to long range unguided rockets, unguided short-range ballistic missiles, small numbers of intermediate unguided Scuds, in addition to precision-guided munitions, including anti-tank guided missiles and unmanned aerial systems. So this is not Hamas. This is not Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This is a formidable terrorist military, larger than some European militaries. So I think that explains maybe some of the Israeli hesitancy, and frankly, some concern, and based on my research, some valid concern that Israel is not as prepared as it would need to be to confront a foe like that. And so those seem to be some of the dynamics at play. Behnam, from the Islamic Republic, sorry to keep asking you to give, but you're the best in town on these issues, so I'm eager for your
Intonation
thoughts.
is more art than science.
Yeah. But do you agree with my premise that up to this point, there's been a desire on the part of Iran and Hezbollah to avoid going to a full-scale war? One, do you agree with that premise? And two, if so, why is that?
It's neither black nor white, and I know that may sound like a cop-out answer.
It's like a lawyer or an economist there. What are you doing?
We have three hands.
Yeah, okay, 3 hands. I don't have that many.
No, honestly, it's neither black nor white, because there are things predating October 7 in both groups, but particularly with respect to Iran, that help bring us to this new risk-taking that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. And one might say, well, Iran isn't firing everything it has all at once, so clearly it's restrained or clearly it's deterred. That's simply not the case. This newfound military capability, this precision strike capability, ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, multiple kinds of drones, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, suicide drones, what have you. Taken together, all of this is giving the regime a new lease on life. And ironically, the weaker it feels at home, the more it will want to project strength abroad. We saw this even during the height of the Massa Amini protests, for example, when the first American to be killed with an Iranian ballistic missile was in the fall of 2022. And no one even really said anything because attention was not on Iraq. It was rightly on what was going on in Iran. But still, that was a military strike that went unresponded to. Moral of the story is this newfound capability is fostering a greater willingness to take risk by Iranian political leaders. Coupled with the people at the helm today, yes, they remember Reagan. Yes, they remember the Iran-Iraq War. Yes, they remember drinking the poison chalice. But the more salient and vivid memory they have is Obama saying Assad must go, and Assad still being there. The more salient memory they have is the relatively free hand they had in Iraq during the war on terror, is the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, is the rope-a-doping of Saudi Arabia. It is all of this stuff together that is fostering greater risk-taking, and that will lead to more chances of less restraint and more overt shooting wars between Iran and Israel, as well as potentially even with Lebanese Hezbollah. Far too long we've treated this growing arsenal. We've worked together many years, same with Sean. We've seen the number grow, 80,000, 100,000, 120,000, 150,000. Now we're at 200,000, you just said. And it's not like only the advanced systems can kill people. That Phalak 1 rocket can't go more than 10 kilometers. And even if you fired on a lofty trajectory, maybe you can get a little bit of a change there. But these are weapons designed to kill people. So the treatment of this vast arsenal as merely a knife against the neck of the Israelis, such that the Israelis won't ever do anything against Iran's crown jewel, the nuclear program, is a necessary but insufficient explainer. And the other half is that these are weapons designed to kill, and they're part of a larger offensive strategy that is designed to create multiple boom and bust rounds of violence that lead to less than optimal Israeli political outcomes, not military outcomes, less than optimal Israeli political compromises as to how it's forced to live amongst this neighborhood, that ultimately will redound to the advantage in the medium to long term of the axis of resistance. So they're not deterred, their weapons are giving them a new lease on life, and this stuff, which as much as the literature says is largely deterrent, is actually fostering an evolution as to how these groups are willing to use force and the changing thresholds.
That's great. Isn't one of the major reasons why the Islamic Republic of Iran and Hezbollah have been reluctant up till now to go to a full-scale war with Israel is because the primary purpose of Hezbollah from the Islamic Republic of Iran's perspective is to serve as a deterrent against an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program, one, and two, they don't want Lebanon to look like Gaza.
Well, they don't want Lebanon to look like Gaza, but certainly if Lebanon becomes even more of a failed state, the thing with the axis of resistance is that they can manage chaos better than us, and they can exploit failed states and empty spaces better than us, where we have to kind of build upwards. So they have a greater, again, risk tolerance there. But they also don't want to lose Hezbollah either. They also don't want to lose one major front against the Israelis either. And that is creating a dampener effect. But that dampener is running up against that growing confidence that we're talking about, such that Nasrallah is supposed to be speaking today or tomorrow, but I imagine
the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The leader of Lebanese Hezbollah is supposed to be speaking today or tomorrow, but I imagine that which Hezbollah said, the leader of Hezbollah said in early fall, contrasts drastically with what Hezbollah is doing today. Early fall was a relatively restrained speech from Hezbollah, but Hezbollah was the first militia to enter the fight. So there's again this changing risk tolerance that the conventional military deterrent element of its arsenal is a necessary but not sufficient explanation.
We saw the crossing of tell me if you disagree, we saw a crossing of the Rubicon on April 13th and 14th in terms of direct Iranian attacks from Iranian soil against Israel, a first. And as human psychology teaches us, once you do something once, it's sometimes it's easier to do it a second time in terms of inertia. And we've seen arguably a solidifying of this network of terrorist groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and it seems to me a safe planning assumption, an unfortunate and safe and necessary planning assumption for Americans and Israelis, that any major future conflict between Israel and or the United States and any of these groups, we have to assume that all of them will come in against us at the same time. Do you agree with that?
Exactly. It's with all of these groups, it's a measure of volume. I think just hours before the reported killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, there was a story representing a historic first that the Iraqi Shia militias may have fired a ballistic missile towards Eilat. We've known since 2019 that Iran has moved short-range ballistic missiles capable of striking Israel to at least, we think, Anbar province in western Iraq, even though Anbar is not really a Shia stronghold. That's a separate story. But nonetheless, these are changing dynamics. New weapons, new targets, new geographies means that Iran can basically orchestrate a wider war at a time of its choosing. And that is what I fear as we're thinking through what a potential revenge scenario may look like. Could the Houthis be moved onto steroids? Might Iran move more offensive capabilities onto the territory of one of its proxies? There's a whole endless series of basements here. And so I think it's more of a question of volume, and I think the Israelis call this connecting the fronts or unifying the fronts.
Right.
And we're living, the Dean Acheson memoir, Present at Creation, we're living in the present at creation moment of what this new militia-led order in the region could be.
John, I'm interested in your you've talked about a little bit, interested in anything more you want to say about the popular mood that you're seeing in Israel and the disposition of Israeli leaders. We got more than 60,000 Israelis displaced from their homes. We've had more than 24 Israelis killed. A country roughly the size of New Jersey has effectively become smaller, if you will. This is clearly unacceptable from both a security, popular, and political perspective. No doubt, Israel has to do something, I would think. But if Israel goes into a full-scale war with Hezbollah, either by choice or because it's forced to, do you worry that that's playing right into the Islamic Republic of Iran's strategy of wearing Israel down, fighting the proxy puppets rather than going at the puppet master?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking exactly the right question right now, because I think my sense is that Israel's not actually been fighting with a strategy for really most of the last 10 months. I do think that, the change in tactics and posture over the last week that we've already covered, the targeted assassinations deep in enemy territory, may signal a change of sorts. But I think that Israel's been in a defensive crouch really for almost the last 10 months. And that's not how you win a war, right? And so what I think we're watching is a strategy that Iran has deliberately put into play, and that is that it is fighting a war of attrition against Israel. And that runs 180 degrees against the doctrine of the IDF, right? They want lightning quick wars, decisive victories. That is the way that the Israelis have fought their battles in the past, and it has served them well. They walked away maybe in some cases bruised, but certainly not battered and on top. This has been 10 months of just a brutal battle where they've really been fighting a tactical threat using a lot of munitions against one entity while the others continue to arm up and to prepare for additional rounds. And so when you look at what Iran may be wanting to do here, right, they'd like to probably keep this going for another 10 months and force the Israelis to spend down their missile defense and their precision munitions and to exhaust their troops and to, fray the nerves of the politicians and of the general public. Now, I think, there are now very open questions, important questions that need to be answered in terms of whether Israel has, in fact, pivoted its strategy and it's going to start taking the fight abroad. That would probably at least force Iran to reconsider the price that it would pay for the war that it's waging. But then comes the question of what's going on in Israel proper. Are they ready for another round? And I think I'll just say this: I watch Israeli media every day, and I try to talk to Israelis every day as well, just to get a sense of what's going on. And I try to get a pretty good cross section, a good sampling. I don't get the sense that people have given up hope. I don't get a sense that they're willing to raise the white flag. I mean, this is a country that believes deeply in itself and believes in its right to exist. And it believes that it has justice and morality on its side. And just before we convened here today, I had a fascinating conversation with a religious guy, lives in Jerusalem, works in the bureaucracy. And, I said, how are you holding up? And he just said, we're ready for the next front. We're ready for Hezbollah if it has to happen. And he was smiling about it. And it's just not anything that's not my reaction, right? If I knew that my country had just gone through 10 months of war and I had to go, think about a different front. But there is, I think, a sense of this is the war that needs to be fought. The big concern I have, it's not the Israeli morale, it's not the Israeli people. By the way, the Israeli war fighters, this is a point of pride for almost every Israeli that I've talked to. They are so proud of the young generation of fighters that has come up in this war, that they have performed beautifully on the battlefield. They surprised everyone with how quickly they vanquished the vast majority of Hamas. I mean, there is a lot of pride in what's going on here. But my primary concern, again, it's not the people. I'm concerned about the government of Israel right now, the lack of strategy exhibited by Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet, the lack of direction in terms of, what is the offensive capability that Israel's bringing that is going to deter the Iranian regime. I have not seen that. And that is, again, what I'm hoping. I just had a piece that came out in the Free Press. I was working with Barry Weiss on this over the last couple of days. I think we're beginning to see a shift in strategy. Maybe it's the first real sign of a counteroffensive. And that is really, I think, what the Israelis need to see. It's what Iran needs to see. It's what the Arab world, those who are considering a deeper alliance with Israel, the Abraham Accords 2.0, as Behnam called it. That's what I think is needed right now. And, I think right now it remains to be seen. The problem, of course, is that, if, this is the new strategy and Israel continues to strike deep into enemy territory, and then Iran and its proxies begin to strike back out of anger, or out of desperation, that's an escalation ladder, right? That we're climbing the escalation ladder in the event that happens. And the question really, I think, when you get down to it, final analysis, is whether Israel has what it takes to supersede that which came before it in the escalation, right? And that's, I think, that's got to be the big question here. Is there something that Israel can do that ultimately convinces Iran that this fight is no longer worth it? The Israeli people will be behind the government if they choose to go that route, but they really need to make a decision soon.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
John's point and your point previously triggered a question for both of you. John, I'm quite worried. I'd love to know what you think about Hamas leadership 2.0. Some people are thinking deputy stuff, Khalid Mishal. Is it a shell of itself? Is this more of a stun than a musical chairs that the group can afford to play? What do you see going on there? And for Brad, John mentioned the country that he was worried about was the Israeli leadership. But in that situation where you have newfound Israeli resolve, I'm wondering, what do you think about the American leadership here, with or without a change in November of this year? Where would we be on, trying to be the wind beneath the wings if the Israelis do want to take this different path and become kind of happy warriors to the north and are willing to climb that escalation ladder that he said? Maybe just a little.
Yeah, no, two great questions. John, I'll let you go first, but we did the mind meld there because I want to use the rest of our time after John's answer to really focus on U.S. policy. So, John, you want to answer that, and then we'll shift to U.S. policy?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two recognizable leaders left right now in Hamas. I mean, really, to be honest, not that any of these are household names in the United States, but you've got Khalid Meshal, who has not really been a consequential leader of Hamas for quite some time. You may recall that he was the one that the Israelis nearly assassinated in Jordan in 1997, but he's not exactly been a headline maker in the subsequent
Hasn't
year.
he been hanging out in cushy hotels, John, in Qatar for a while?
Yeah,
getting 5-star room service.
As much as you can live the dream in Doha.
Yeah. Right next to all the Taliban folks that were there previously.
Yeah. I mean, I happen to think it's an armpit.
Yeah,
but,
no, it's the cantina. Every time I think of Qatar, I think of the Star Wars cantina myself.
Anyway, that's right.
Anyway,
every bad actor that you could possibly have, that's where they hang out. And so Meshal's been there. He's been living high on the hog, if you can say that about someone who's a pious Muslim. He's not consequential, right now anyway, in Hamas politics. And then the other guy is Yahya Sinwar, right? This is the man who actually launched the war out of Gaza. He's brought devastation to the Gaza Strip.
He's not in a 5-star hotel. He's probably in a tunnel in Gaza,
right
I would think.
In squalor.
I think I know which of the two I would rather be. But
yeah. I mean, I guess if I had to choose between one or the other, but really, what we're looking at though are two leaders. One that has brought total devastation to his people. The other one whose star has fallen. When I look around, I look at Rory killed in January, Issa killed in March, Dave killed in July, Haniyeh killed, a couple of days ago. Their ranks are thinned out, man. And they're well-trained fighters. Most of them are killed or injured, 2/3 to 3/4 right now, killed or injured. The ranks of the fighters have thinned out as well. The infrastructure in Gaza is a disaster. The supply lines have been cut because the Israelis now control the Philadelphia corridor. If I'm, look, anything can happen in the Middle East. I always say there's no room for optimism in this region, right? And so I can't truly be optimistic yet. But if I'm just putting on the clearest lenses that I can and trying to get a sense of what Hamas's future looks like, it looks bleak, gentlemen. It does not look like they're going to survive this. The leadership, I don't know of anybody that could step forth right now and pick up where, some of these other guys left off. That front, I think, is nearing its end. But the bad news is that there's 5 other fronts that Israel's still going to have to fight on, and that is Iran's plan. That is what they're trying to do, and they were prepared for this moment. I always believe that Hamas sacrificed itself on the altar of the Iranian axis on October 7th. There was no way for this terror group to survive. And it is now nearing death's door, but we've got this whole other chain of events that is likely to come after.
John, very quickly before we transition to Behnam's second great question and move to conclude here, how would you respond to someone that says, pro-Israel American say that, yeah, you're right, man, the Hamas leadership has really been decimated. That's exactly what you'd predict and want Israel to do after October 7th. That's great. But because Hamas and its followers and supporters have such a rabid anti-Semitic, anti-Israel philosophy that you're just going to have a new generation of leaders rise up and replace them. How would you respond to that?
There always will be new leaders that will rise up after old leaders are destroyed. You may recall during the second Intifada, somewhere I'm guessing around 2003 to 2005, if memory serves, there was a series of targeted killings that removed the upper echelons of Hamas, and new leaders came in. The difference, though, is they had infrastructure. And right now I see Gaza, I see rubble. I see a collapsed structure. Look, Hamas can continue to exist as an idea, as people have suggested, but I will say the faces that represent that idea are rapidly being removed. And there are few people that can rally this constituency to continue to carry the mantle of Hamas. I suspect that we're going to see this terror group turn into a shell of itself. It will likely still exist, but don't expect it to be a formidable challenge moving forward. But again, I don't think that, that's good news. But, in chess terms, we've taken the Israelis have taken maybe a knight off the chessboard, but all the other pieces are still there. And you can't, that means either you're going to keep trying to take each piece off one by one, which is painstaking and costly, or you have to start to do what I think Behnam and I and Brad, and I think, we all probably agree that Israel needs to start to think more seriously about targeting the king, actually targeting the regime, because I think that's the only way. If that price, with the Iranians feel that that's a price that they may have to pay, that's the moment that they likely stand down.
No, thank you, John. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of the American experience in going after leaders of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and some leaders are more valuable than others. I'm thinking of the taking out of Soleimani, for example. And some people are easy to replace, and some people are hard to replace, and you really have to kind of dig into each of those. But that what you said makes total sense. So let's conclude here with U.S. policy. Behnam, you were kind enough to ask me a question, so that's gracious of you. Boy, we need 3 hours. We don't have 3 hours. Here's a 2-minute take. I think that Biden, as I try to be fair-minded and call balls and strikes, I think the Biden administration, a week or two after October 7th, was among the best of the presidency rhetorically, and then they backed up that rhetoric with action in terms of sending an extraordinary quantity and array of weapons to Israel. But at the same time, we saw an escalating rhetoric against Israel that unfortunately helped Israel's enemies and at a horrible time and very counterproductively, frankly emboldening Hamas, delaying the agreement of ceasefire, almost certainly emboldening Iran and Hezbollah. And so I'd say a mix of very positive and very negative things from the Biden administration. As we sit here right now, and my information is a few days old, but I believe it's still true, we still have one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs that is on hold. That was put on hold out of concerns for how Israel might use that in Rafah. That's a deep, deep mistake that the Biden administration should end yesterday, because Israel needs that to deter a major war with Hezbollah, and if deterrence fails they will need that 2,000-pound bomb for a major war with Hezbollah for all kinds of reasons, including the types of tunnels they'll confront and other things. And also, there are some concerns, and friends of Israel should be looking into this. There are some concerns that there have been at least 2 major tranches of weapons, and specifically air-launched munitions, guidance kits, and fuses that Israel has requested after October 7th, that have not been formally notified to Congress for congressional approval. So not a formal hold. This is where some of the conversations get confused. The one formal hold is the one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs that was for Rafah, that is really short-sighted because you're going to need that for Hezbollah, and Israel has expended a lot of munitions. But there may be at least 2 major tranches of air-launched munitions, guidance kits, and fuses that Israel needs that the administration has not yet formally noticed to Congress. And I'll end with this, not getting too wonky, but a lot of those were provided after October 7th, but the previous congressional approval was up to certain amounts. And so once they reach those certain amounts, you need a new congressional notification to go send additional. And that's so destructive and dangerous right now, and so helping of Israel's enemies, because those are potentially the very types of air-launched munitions that Israel will need for a major war with Hezbollah, including one munition, perhaps, that is designed to penetrate deep into the ground and blow up the terrorists and the terror tunnels down below and minimize civilian casualties. And if some of the things being held are also JDAMs, these guidance kits, those are specifically designed for the purpose of avoiding civilian casualties. So that makes no sense because Israel, unlike Hamas, wants to avoid civilian casualties, and you can be able to avoid civilian casualties more effectively if you actually have those guidance kits. So
we need to support the Israelis. We need to make sure that they have a credible threat of force with regard to Iran. The longer that Iran believes that Israel is going to be restrained by its best ally, the more it is going to push, the more it is going to test the Israelis. And by the way, they're testing us, right? When we don't respond to Houthi attacks, we don't respond to Shia militia attacks out of Iraq or Syria, when we allow those to pass without retribution, without a price to pay, that's what basically prompts the regime to believe that it can continue to push the region toward a full war, no cost. That's what needs to change, and I'm hoping that maybe with the shackles off of the president, the next 6 months, we all know he's a lame duck. Maybe the next 6 months he can choose the foreign policy that he believes would fit the U.S. best. That's an optimistic take on things. The pessimistic take is that he's going to be managed by the party in order to set up his successor for policies that might resonate with the progressive wing of the party. That would be a serious concern because that would likely mean the continued posture of standing down. But really, we do need to see the U.S. provide Israel with that credible threat, back it up with our words, with our policies, with our sanctions, with our political pressure. That's what needs to be done if we want to steer this to a soft landing. And I will say, those exit ramps right now, they are not looking plentiful, right? There are a couple left right now before we potentially arrive at a regional war. And so, if we're going to start making changes, I think they need to happen soon.
Well, John and Behnam, you're both colleagues, and I consider you both friends and leading experts on these topics. And I really have enjoyed sitting down with you and talking. I've learned a lot. Thank you for your insights. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us here on Foreign Policy.